Good afternoon, everyone, and we now turn to our final panel session for the day. As we heard earlier, Smith was heavily involved in the politics and indeed global politics of the day. The Wealth of Nations was a policy intervention, and in 3 years' time will commemorate its 250th anniversary. Something else happened in 1776, which we might come to in the discussion. It's perhaps, though, Smith's political economy ideas that have been the most controversial, debated, and often used wrongly to further political agendas. He's been used by the right and the left in political discourse as an inspiration or often justification for their ideas. Some see him as a justification for unrestricted free trade, small government, and the primacy of market as the efficient way of allocating resources. Others use his ideas to warn of the dangers of big business or to advocate for public goods, social welfare, and the likes. Perhaps even more subtly, the name Adam Smith has become used as justification for agendas, whether it be naming of institutes, think tanks, or throwaways in policy debates. So I'm delighted that we can turn to this final session to discuss the policy relevance of Smith for today's global policy debates. And once again, we've secured a stellar panel for you. On the far left, we have Dr. Glory Liu. Glory is a lecturer in social studies at Harvard with institutes in political theory, intellectual history, and political economy. She's a graduate of Stanford, Cambridge, and Berkeley, and is about to start a new role at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. An author of note, her 2022 book, Adam Smith's America, How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism, provides a fascinating account of how Smith's ideas, or more correctly, different particular interpretations of Smith's ideas and the use of Smith's name has been instrumental in key points in American history. And Gloria will touch on some of her writings in her comments today. Next to Gloria, we have Dr. Adam Posen. Adam's president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., widely regarded as the preeminent think tank in the world on issues of international economics, and more generally one of the most trusted and respected centres of policy ideas in the world. A graduate of Harvard, his expertise in macroeconomic policy, and he's advised leading central banks and global institutions around the world. Between 2009 and 2012, he was a member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, a relatively quiet time to be a central banker. He's been a great friend to the University of Glasgow over the years, including delivering the inaugural Adam Smith Distinguished Lecture in 2018. And even just yesterday, he gave up his time with PhD students from across the UK at the Royal Economic Society annual conference as part of Tercentenary Week. He's received numerous awards and recognitions, including receiving the rare distinction of an honorary CBE in 2014. Adam is going to be talking about the optimistic and declinist view of progress, including back in Smith's time, and we'll explore the question of whether crisis is needed for radical change in policies. Next to Adam, we have Joe Swinson. Joe is Director of Partners for a New Economy, an international philanthropic fund focused on funding research and ideas to develop new ways of economic thinking and new ideas to help support a different type of economy, one that better links into the environment and nature and does more to tackle inbuilt inequalities. Joe is a graduate of LSE and in 2018 was also awarded a CBE. Joe is a retired, or as I like to say to my colleague Kezia Dugdale, a recovering politician. She was the MP for Eastern Bartonshire and was, on election, the youngest member of the House of Commons. A former minister of the UK government, in 2019, Joe was elected the first ever female leader of the Liberal Democrats. As someone whose day job is to advance the new economy, we're very much looking forward to Joe's take on the political economy, policy and business model agenda that she sees in the future. First up, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Sir John Kay. For most of us, we'll have got to know John through the regular columns in the Financial Times, which he wrote for over 20 years, but his career has spanned the worlds of academia, think tanks and business. He's the author of numerous books, from tax through to how to make decisions in a radically uncertain world. He's been a Fellow of St John's College, Oxford since 1970. He's a former director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He was the first dean of the Oxford Said Business School, and he's held chairs there and at the LSE. He was knighted in 2021. He also has a CBE. Glory, you and I are slightly lagging behind here, but and John is going to kick us off with some introductory reflections on Smith's relevance for debates of our politics, and then bridge into discussions around the modern market. And before we start, can you join me in welcoming our panellists, please?
Well, thank you, Graeme. Our final session is implications of Smith's thought for policy. And we've heard a good deal this morning about policy already. But if we ask what does Smith's thought imply for political economy, there's a kind of standard story, which is this. Little else is required to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest tolerable barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable but administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural causes of these things. That's the origin or a characterization of what I call caricature Smith. The idea that what Smith represented was the belief that in the afternoon, you will see probably the best known representation of Adam Smith, which is, of course, the representation of him by John Kay. I should say that it was published in the programme for this afternoon without my permission. And the University of Glasgow will be hearing from my lawyers on Monday morning, unless, Graeme, we make a side deal before I actually get to talk to them. But Caricature Smith was the man in favour of individual selfishness and unrestrained free markets. And yet, despite Chicago, that caricature is not actually, as we've heard on several occasions, and will no doubt hear again this afternoon, not at all Smith. So what does Smith have to say to us about policy? Well, I hope we will not spend time this afternoon asking the question, what did Smith have to say about ChatGPT? What would he have done about internet regulation and the like? These discussions are as pointless as asking what did the founding fathers say in the Constitution about internet regulation. They didn't say anything, and get over it. We have to make these kind of decisions for ourselves. What I think we should do this afternoon is ask the question, which of Smith's insights are still valid and illuminating in considering public policy today, and which have been overtaken by events either in thought or in business since the time Smith wrote. And that's certainly what I intend to talk about. So I want to pick out a number of themes from Smith that we can evaluate in that kind of frame of mind. The first idea is the business of business is business. That is a statement that is often attributed to Milton Friedman. As far as I know, Milton Friedman never said it, and it's very unlikely that he would have said it, because it's not what Friedman and the Chicago School intended. But Smith did have views about these kind of things, and you'll all know that he famously said, it's not from benevolence that we look to the baker, the butcher, and the brewer. It is from their self-love. But I think it's worth spelling out for a moment that when Smith talked about the baker, the brewer, the butcher, he was not talking about Associated British Foods, A.B. InBev, and Arthur Daniels Midland. He was talking about the local tradesman who his mother visited each day to buy goods for Adam's supper. Some of you may have read the book Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner. I think it's probably not the most important contribution to Smith's scholarship that has been made, and I'm glad that the University of Glasgow has refrained from coming to that in the course of this agency. But it was not from benevolence that we ask them to do these things, but it's not from their aggressive self-interest either. The butcher, the baker, and the brewer with whom Mrs. Smith dealt were people who took some kind of pride in what it was they did. They were people for whom the business of business was business. They were not there to do good. And Smith said, I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. It is an affectation indeed not very common among merchants, and very few words need be employed in dissuading them from it. I think Smith had clearly not been to any of the ESG conferences, which are a regular part of the conference scene nowadays. And I think he might have been interested in Stiegler's remark. Smith said very few words need be spent in dissuading them from these discussions. Stiegler sardonically observed, I've often wondered what these very few words were. I would indeed quite like to know what they were. The business of business is business. Business is there, in my view, to do business well. It is not to do good, except to the extent, the very substantial extent, that doing business well contributes to the general good. But it is equally, it is not true that the social responsibility of business is to make profits. And that brings one to another central theme of Smith, which has been discussed this morning, which is that he believed in human agency, but he did not believe that economic outcomes were the creation of agency. What he believed was better put, I think, by Adam Ferguson, who said that we look to results which are the result of human action, but not the result of human design. And that was the central Enlightenment thought, which was picked up by Ferguson, was amplified by Smith, which was developed by subsequent thinkers, and of course, which found its fullest expression in the work of Darwin and understanding of evolutionary processes, which came only a century after, almost a century after Smith. We operate in an economy with a system that produces results which in Smith's terms, or in Ferguson's terms, are the result of human actions, but not the product of human design. And that is probably the insight of Smith and his contemporary figures, which is hardest for us to get hold of nowadays. We want to believe that almost everything is the result of human action and design. Whether that is people who believe that politicians of great insight will command moonshots, which ought to be the direction of public policy. I'm sorry for my slip there. I promise it was not intentional. Or in another strand of literature, we have the heroic CEO, in which everything that happens in an organization, however large, is the result of the wisdom or lack of wisdom of Jack Welch or whoever it might be, in which we wonder whether Amazon will survive now that Andy Jassy has taken over from Jeff Bezos. Business, or modern large business, the kind of firms we're talking about, is not like that. It is not the product of single individuals. What is it like? Well, it's the result of the elaboration of another of Smith's key insights, which is the division of labor. That, of course, again, was not an original insight of Smith. Indeed, Adam Ferguson accused him of having plagiarized it from him. But it still remains one of the most important of Smith's insight. And Diane Coyle talked this morning about how far the division of labor has now gone, and I want to come back to that a little later in what I have to say. A final insight, which was spelled out in some of the discussions this morning, is that the advance of human prosperity and human knowledge is the product of coordination. This is what follows from understanding that actions are the result of human agency rather than design, and from understanding the division of labor. That it's the coordination of these things that produces, whether in business or in politics or in intellectual development, what it is we all want and see. The story that George W. Bush said to Tony Blair, that the problem with the French is they don't have a word for entrepreneur, is sadly apocryphal, but it's quite insightful to go back to the original French meaning of entrepreneur, which is the person who takes between, the person who joins things together. And this combination impact is actually critical to understanding modern business and the advance of both of intellectual thought and of modern economies. It's what Joe Henry, in what, if one was to look at in the last decade, a book which somewhat resembles The Wealth of Nations, I think I would point to in its breadth of insight and knowledge and analysis. Joe Henry's The Secret of Our Success sounds like a self-help book. It kind of is, but it's quite a lot better than that. It's a collective intelligence, which means that nobody, literally nobody in the world, knows how to build an Airbus, but 10,000 people working together do. That's where the division of labor and coordination have actually taken us over the last 200 years. So my final question was, how has business changed since the time of Smith in ways that mean we have to rethink some of his ideas? Well, as people have said earlier in this session, or in this event, in Smith's day, he conceived productive activity as basically being about manufacturing. And that's an idea that still resonates with a great many people, that everything else is somehow frivolous or an add-on to manufacturing, even though manufacturing employment even though manufacturing employment in Britain and the United States now counts for less than 10% of total employment. We're not making things anymore, and that's not, straightforwardly, a bad thing. We are, more and more of GDP consists of services, and even if we look at modern manufactured products, it's worth taking a moment to see what they actually are. What I've done on this slide is to take 10 products. The carronade, which was the most important Scottish product, or Scottish manufactured product in the time of Smith. It was actually made, it was a gun, it was a naval gun, and it was made at Stenhouse Muir. And Edward Canning paid Smith for going to his silly pin factory as Canada. Smith didn't go to any pin factory, put that to one side, nor did he go to this manufacturing plant, which is probably what put here is the weights and the prices of these different items. And you can see the extent to which manufactured goods have become much less resource intensive and much more concept intensive over the 200 years since Smith. And that ranges from the cheapest is actually, per pound, is actually the carronade. Modern rifle cost 100 times as much per pound or per kilo. And at the bottom I put the pin, Smith's iconic product, versus what I think is the most expensive product by weight, which is currently on the market, which is the Pfizer COVID vaccine, which clocks in at about £500,000 per kilo. And the reason for that is not, well, it is a bit that Pfizer are raking it in, but it's primarily that this is the way products have changed to become intensive in intangible rather than tangible items. The next change, which is closely related to that, is the move to hollow corporations. The hollow corporation was a term invented to describe Nike, which does not manufacture any of its products. It sources them all from Asia. All it does is advertises, distributes, and to some degree retails them. Of course, the even more archetypal hollow corporation today is Apple, which has already been mentioned. Its products are not manufactured by Apple. The largest assembler of them, rather, is Foxconn, which is a Chinese mainland subsidiary of a Taiwanese company. The largest supplier of components for the iPhone is actually Samsung, which is Apple's principal competitor. Apple doesn't own anything except its iconic headquarters at Cupertino. Some of you may have been to its flagship store in Regent Street, which is actually owned by 25% the King, 75% the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. That's where the ownership of capital is now to be found. That's an illustration of what I call capital as a service. You're almost certain to have passed Amazon warehouses. It's very unlikely that Amazon owns them. The dominant owner of Amazon warehouses is actually a San Francisco company of which you probably haven't heard, called Prologis. If you had a delivery in a van labeled Amazon Prime, Amazon almost certainly doesn't own that van either. Amazon doesn't own anything. In fact, it doesn't really own the stock in its warehouses either, because you have paid for them before Amazon has on average paid the supplier of them. That's what I mean by saying we now have capital as a service, that modern corporations buy in the capital they use as services rather than owning that capital. You will all have been in aeroplanes. It's very unlikely, again, that the airline whose logo is on the fuselage owns the plane you fly in. The largest owner of planes in the world is a Dublin-based company called AerCap, again of which you may not have heard. AerCap doesn't own the engines on the plane, however. The airline will have rented the engines or the services of the engines of the plane from a company like GE, Rolls-Royce, or Pratt & Whitney, but Rolls-Royce won't own the engines either. It will have sold them on to an engine-owning company. The largest of that is a company called GATX, which also owns a lot of the world's railroad cars. I could go on and on like this. But what I think you will see from this is the fourth thing that I want to emphasize has changed since the time of Adam Smith. Capitalism as it was in the time of the Industrial Revolution was characterized by what I think of as the tripartite linkage, in which personal wealth, which was based on what Smith called primitive accumulation, Marx called, he called it prior accumulation. It was Marx who called it primitive accumulation. Accumulation of personal wealth, which then was translated into the ownership of productive facilities like the Carron Works, which then led to control of the business. So the Carron Works was owned by two families called the Cardells and the Garbetts. They had provided the funds to build the plant, and they were the people who provided the day-to-day management of the plant. That's that tripart linking from wealth to physical assets to control of property. You can see that by pulling capital out of the middle of that, we've destroyed that linkage. And to the extent that there is a linkage now, it runs in the other direction, from control of business to personal wealth, which is the source of the riches of Jeff Bezos, Bernard Arnault, Elon Musk, and the people who are today the richest people in the world. So let me end with one note, which is to reinforce something that was said this morning. Smith's analysis was based on observation. It probably wasn't literal observation. He didn't go to the pin factory. He didn't go to the Cairn Works. We heard this morning about the tobacco lords. I suspect he didn't spend much time with the tobacco lords. I think he spent time more agreeably, with his colleagues here in Glasgow and his circle in Edinburgh. But he read very widely, and he based his analysis on the very considerable knowledge which he'd acquired from that reading. His knowledge of pins was acquired from, we learnt in, and we saw yesterday in the University Library, the receipt which the University of Glasgow provided for Diderot's French Encyclopedia, which was where the pin factory story emerged from. But nevertheless, even if it wasn't based on literal observation, Smith's analysis was based on wide practical knowledge. We economists need to revert to that, because modern economics was characterized some time ago by Eli Devons, who said, if you asked an economist to hypothesize about or to tell you about the observation of horses, he would sit down at his desk with a blank sheet of paper and ask, what would I do with a horse? Or what would I do if I were a horse? And I would add to that, he would now, if he was a modern economist, write down, what would I do if I were a horse H with a rider R and was occupied in a stables S? That's not how, or certainly not the only way how, we should be doing economics. Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to follow that, John. Thank you. I've really enjoyed your thoughts there, and in particular, this issue of how does economics connect to the real world, because that is surely what the function of economics should be about. And if there's one thing that we should take from Adam Smith, was his desire for learning and reading and curiosity, and also to challenge the economic status quo and the assumptions and received wisdom. He was not satisfied to just say that this is how people think it is, and I'm not going to come up with new ideas. And perhaps that is the most valuable takeaway from what he leaves in terms of his legacy, is that spirit of challenge, because economics does need to constantly evolve. The question of what is a successful economy is perhaps the key question. And that is an inherently political question. It's not one which you can find out the answer to by sitting down with a piece of paper and a bunch of letters from the alphabet. It is a question which collectively, as society, people need to be engaged in understanding. What is it that we want from our economy? How do we want it to function? And I take the point that John absolutely rightly makes, that design and intent does not always give you the results that you wish. But nonetheless, the economy is shaped by human behavior, whether intentional or not. The rules by which the economy operates are shaped by us. Indeed, the idea of a free market is one which I think is in some ways an anathema. The idea that you have any market that doesn't have kind of rules and regulations to make sure that people have a degree of trust with one another, particularly in a world that is so interconnected and large as ours. Of course, markets have to operate according to rules, and those rules have to be set. And even some of those rules and assumptions that were designed and created many, many years ago, we should still recognize are constraints that are imposed by human beings. And as such, if they no longer work for the challenges that we're facing, they can be changed by human beings. Economics is not one of the kind of natural sciences like biology or like physics, where there is some perfect law out there that is just waiting to be discovered. It is something which is inherently bound up in the behavior of human beings and therefore can be shaped. And I would argue that the answer to what a successful economy is one that creates the conditions for people to thrive. And in some ways that ought not to be very controversial, but of course how you get there and what that actually looks like, these are certainly very contested issues. Because I even think this issue of what is wealth, what is value, is something which we are defining far too narrowly. You know, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. How do we define the wealth of nations? I mean, these days, we effectively see GDP as a proxy for that. And GDP is a very useful metric in lots of ways. It does tell us things, but it doesn't tell us everything. And since it's been created, it has been critiqued. Perhaps never better than in 1968 by Robert Kennedy, saying it measures all that except which makes life worthwhile. And you know, particularly with the challenges we face now, I think the question of how do we measure value, what is wealth, is important. Is it being able to breathe clean air? How is that factored in? If you are living in Canada at the moment and there are wildfires raging, what value do you put on the ability to be able to open a window or to be able to not have fear for anyone who has respiratory conditions? What about being able to go for a dip in a river that doesn't have sewage floating in it, to take something perhaps a little closer to home in the UK? What about not having, the value of not having an increasing frequency and deadliness of extreme weather events, such as heat waves, which kill people, floods, which kill people, wildfires, which kill people and are intensely destructive, increased severity of hurricanes. You know, it doesn't matter which part of the world you look at, we can see this happening. And what value is placed on that? Very little currently. And I would argue that there's two areas in particular which are especially undervalued, and that is care and nature. John referenced the book by Katrine Marsal, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, which may not be the most scholarly work, but does raise an important point. You know, that issue of care in our economy, like literally nothing happens in our society or economy if there is not care at the heart. If babies are not looked after, if we do not look after those who are more vulnerable due to age or disability, if we do not care to make sure that there is health and that there is food created, you know, these are the essentials of life, and yet so much of that is entirely outside what is seen and counted as our economy, and even the extent to which it is counted. You know, if your parents are in a care home, the value of that care is effectively defined as the very low wages that the carers are paid to provide that care. And you know, the idea that there is a correlation and a connection between how we actually value those things and what they are paid for is, I think there is a massive mismatch there, which we saw perhaps most extremely as we have just lived through, you know, a pandemic, right? What have been the values that we have attached to care? Health, social care, community care. You know, 750,000 people signing up to volunteer in the NHS to collect prescriptions for their neighbours, to do shopping for their neighbours. You know, the value of that, you know, is far beyond any kind of monetary level. And we should be recognising that. We clapped on our doorsteps for the essential workers. And who were the essential workers? You know, it wasn't the financiers and the advertising executives. It was those care workers. It was those people working in very low-paid roles in retail, in food distribution, in food preparation and creation. So we have this massive, massive disconnect on care, and then also on nature. You know, it is to the extent that nature is incorporated into the economy, it's effectively seen like an externality. Perhaps maybe you could try to price in with a carbon tax. But that is also just inadequate to the scale of the challenge. You know, we have a Nobel Prize winner in economics who has produced research that says the optimal level of global warming is between 3 and 4 degrees from an economic perspective. And you just have to say, well, perhaps we need more than an economic perspective on this. Perhaps we need a climate science perspective on a question like that. We've got an Earth Commission recently that published a report a fortnight ago about the planetary boundaries, the limits of our planet. And we are breaching 7 of the 8 of those safe limits for humanity. And that's perhaps where I would just start to conclude by saying, look, pandemics, ecological crises, these are our challenges of today. They are not linear. We all got very familiar with the R rate, knowing that if you delayed locking down by a week, that was not just, a week later that the same amount of damage was done. Actually, that could be catastrophic. And when you look at tipping points in environmental issues, we've got exactly the same issue. They are complex, they are systemic problems. You cannot parcel them up into small individual issues and hope that you get the sum of the answers is going to be the right set of answers. You need to look at them in a much more holistic way. And that's where things like competition, I mean, yes, it's a great concept. Yes, it's very powerful. But it wasn't competition that gave us those vaccines that are so highly valued now. It was cooperation. Yes, there was business in there, but there was also governments and science grants and making sure that different sectors were working together. And in terms of rational self-interest, again, it can work, and for some issues and for some economic problems, it is the right answer. But, some of you will be familiar with the marshmallow test, which is often done on children to understand their ability to have delayed gratification. And you offer a child, a 5-year-old or so, on a marshmallow, or if they wait 10 minutes, they can have 2 marshmallows. And the adult will go out of the room and they will leave the marshmallow on a plate in front of the child for 10 minutes, and they will see whether or not they will wait to get the 2 marshmallows. And children that wait apparently end up having better outcomes and so on. But I mean, any of us who know young children also know how hard that is. But I would say that's not just an issue for children, right? We are notoriously bad at long-term decision-making that is rational. What we are doing environmentally, currently, collectively, is not rational. In fact, we are currently, collectively and catastrophically failing the marshmallow test. So given the challenges that we face, we definitely need economics to keep evolving. We definitely need that spirit of Adam Smith to look for new ideas, new concepts, ways that economics can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
Thank you, Graeme. Thank you for including me on this great event, and congratulations to you, the Adam Smith Business School, and the University of Glasgow for making people on a beautiful Saturday in Glasgow come inside to talk about Adam Smith. Or I shouldn't say making, enticing, have a value proposition. If I could get my slides up, please, yeah. So what I want to talk about is a little bit different, maybe not orthogonal to, but a little bit different than what the 2 preceding speakers did, in the different sense of political economy. And my title is Positive and Negative Optimism for Economies. It's really a takeoff on Isaiah Berlin's 2 concepts of liberty, that I think in Adam Smith there are 2 concepts of optimism, a positive and a negative. And just as with the positive and negative liberties in Isaiah Berlin, that one is sort of the negative one is more restricted, classical liberal, and the positive is more sort of idealistic, associated with participatory democracy. I want to talk about the 2 ways of thinking about optimism from Smith. But in particular, what I want to do, sort of going along with what Graeme previewed, is put this in the international context. So 40 years ago this summer, I took a course on modern British history, taught by a Marxian historian. It shows you how weird I was. I didn't just sacrifice a Saturday. I spent a whole summer doing that. But anyway, and one of the striking things was that the worrying about UK decline it's very early in modern history, and it's very economic. It's that we're falling behind, the Germans, the Americans, whoever is or RT, and we have to get ahead. And it was backed up with this sense of self, could be empire, could be technological innovation in the microphone field. Cheers. Is this on? Hello? Okay. But anyway, the main point being that this sense of relative decline, both in the sense intellectually of benchmarking, how should a society be doing, how should your economy be doing, but also in a much more visceral, fearful sense, oh my God, if we decline, then ... pervaded British and now American economic discussion for a very long time. And I think Smith tells us that there's reason to forget about all that. So if I get the next slide, please. So like I said, I think there are two concepts of the political economy of liberty. The positive one is the one John Kay already quoted, which is essentially growth is the natural order of things. If you don't have too evil a government and too much instability, you get good results. And this goes with the idea that the growth comes from the individual actions. And you can sort of see this as, there are other scholars in the room much more, including Gloria to my left, who know this much better than I, but you can sort of see this as coming out of the Hobbesian tradition, that as long as you don't have chaos of civil war, you have a relatively efficient government that's somewhat accountable, good things happen. The second is, the negative is what I'll call the wealth is hard to destroy. And this refers to a quote in 1777, the American War for Independence, or whatever you call it here, turned in a bad direction for Great Britain, starting with the loss of the Battle of Saratoga. And a young, rich friend of Adam Smith, Sir John Sinclair, wrote to him and said, if we go on at this rate, the nation shall be ruined. And Adam Smith famously wrote back and said, be assured, young friend, there is a great deal of ruin in a nation. And that to me is actually a very profound point about optimism. That we have this tendency in economics and foreign affairs to assume that every decision is very momentous. That crises come, and they're not only a crisis in human terms, as Joe very articulately, elegantly put out about the experience of the pandemic, meaning it matters for us right now, but that these crises change the course of history, determine the fate of nations. That's actually not true. So, I mean, if you want to think about declinism and so on, Italy's been in decline for 400 years. Seems to be okay if you go there. I mean, joking aside, it really is okay. There is a lot of ruin in a nation. Bad things come, bad things go. And again, the policy may matter for minimizing human suffering or helping human achievement in a given moment. But the long-term course of growth, we're increasingly learning, is something that's really, going back to something John said, isn't necessarily under policy agency. It's not something you can necessarily affect. So if I can have my next slide, please. So if you read Adam Smith with this in mind, and obviously this is more about wealth of nations than theory of moral sentiments, you know, we have this distance that he just doesn't have this talk about competitiveness of countries, this talk about competition and from abroad and crisis. That's just not concepts for him. Although, you know, he's only 100 years removed from regime change in the United Kingdom, 150 years removed from civil war in the United Kingdom. This is a period where maybe not in living memory, but certainly in folk memory, plagues were still there, and the outbreaks of cholera that were recurrent in the 18th and 19th century, for example. And yet, he sees the impediments to growth, again, as in that positive optimism view as just what economists now refer to, perhaps too limitedly, as institutions or good institutions, property rights, rule of law, non-too extortionate government. And for all his writing about free trade, and I know rightly, the school and law school hosted a big conference on international trade, and my colleague Doug Irwin and others have spoken about this during the day. You know, he's the great advocate of free trade, and this leads to the repeal of the Corn Laws. But he doesn't talk about the threat from abroad. Now, you do have the mercantilists writing at this time. You get Friedrich List a few years later, writing from Germany in a very much sort of competitivist point of view. You have to husband your nation's resources so that you are advantaged versus these other nations. Smith doesn't have any of that. And so he has this sort of implicit message: policy mistakes are going to happen, setbacks are going to happen, you just move on. But as I've said, we've had this period in the UK, and I would say in the US and many other places, where you speak about this decline all the time. And you then get into this mindset that there has to be a crisis. And I confronted this in my own work twice. In the late 90s, I got involved in talking about the Japanese economy and the problems it was going through. And there were a lot of people in Japan, as well as outside Japan, but more importantly in Japan, including serious politicians, who would argue, this is so bad, this recession is so bad, we need to provoke a crisis, because otherwise they'll never get themselves together. Maybe it's your marshmallow test. The image usually used was frog in a pot, or lobster in a pot, that you start cooking and it takes a while for the heat to get up and you're dead before you realize it. But so there was all this talk about we have to tighten monetary policy and fiscal policy, we have to provoke a crisis in order to prevent what's going on. And I argued, I spent several years of my life fighting very hard from the outside trying to say that's not a good idea. That's not the way to think about this. And here we are, it's now 30 years since the great crash of the Japanese economy, more than 30 years. And again, like Italy, it's not so bad. There were things squandered, there was human potential lost, there were suicides. I'm not saying it was not bad, but crisis was not really what you should have been thinking about. And to a lesser degree, we had that in the debates over monetary policy and then austerity here in the UK, in the US, in the Euro area, in the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008, 9, 10, where you had people saying, well, it's not just a crisis exogenously, that there was this financial shock, but that we really need to transform our economies, we really need to stop the zombie companies, we really need to stop the moral hazard, all these things. And what we've seen is, to the degree that governments got it wrong, in my view, and pursued excessive austerity or didn't pursue enough monetary ease, we've seen very bad political outcomes. Now again, this is, of course you can flip that around and say, well, you are saying policy matters. And yes, of course it does. But my point is just trying not to think about how am I doing versus everybody else? How is my country doing in these league tables? As Paul Krugman put it before he became the pundit that he is, competitiveness is a dangerous obsession. Countries don't compete in reality. And so we've had this system, this series of incidents in the UK, which are, to me, interesting, that a bunch of former colonies have now surpassed the UK in per capita income. I mean, to me, I assumed that once Ireland surpassed you all in average per capita income, people in the UK would get kind of peeved, even though it was all by cheating with American corporate profits. But anyway, leave that aside. Didn't seem to matter that much. Canada, Australia have now beaten the UK in per capita income, and nobody cared. And I'm actually glad. I'm actually reassured that that's the case, because I think that's what Adam Smith would have wanted. So if I have my next slide, please. So this is my one chart. This is a long view starting roughly around the time Wealth of Nations was published, not his birthday, but Wealth of Nations. And the red line is the best estimate we could get of GDP per capita purchasing power parity. And what you see is there are these periods, the Depression, the late 60s, and then of course the financial crisis. But basically, UK GDP per capita is on this exponential growth path for the last 250 years. And the decline of empire, the victory in World War II, all of these things didn't really interfere with trend growth. We are where we are. There's a lot of ruin in the nation. Whereas the share of the UK in world GDP, again, we tried to use comparable sources as best we could, at its peak, at the end of the Victorian era, the UK constituted 12% of global GDP. It has been on a much bouncier than income downward trend until the last few years, where it's at roughly 2% of world GDP. Notice, these lines are not correlated. The decline, the relative decline, had no information value for the strong onward path of GDP. So to bring it back to where I started, I think there are two concepts of optimism in Adam Smith, the idea that all you have to do is get some basic institutions right. I think that's a profound insight, but I think it overestimates the strength of policy of some of the things John was referring to. I think it underestimates the risks of corruption and misdealing. But I do think the second, more negative form of optimism is quite right, that there's a lot of ruin in the nation. A lot of things can happen. The economy will just keep on going. Wealth remains. You keep on going. There is something natural to this progression. Life is not as fragile from the outside, not as fragile in general as people sometimes make it out to be, and especially not as fragile as a function of your relative standing in the world. And that's something I wish my own government would recognize right now. As I sit here in this wonderfully diverse audience, this university and city that is wonderfully globalized, and my government, two successive governments in the US have decided relative standing in the world is what matters for per capita well-being, and it's wrong. So I wish they'd read Smith. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. And again, my thanks and congratulations to Graeme and the whole team for putting on such a phenomenal week. And I've heard year of celebrations for Smith's birthday. I think he would be quite pleased and also a little bashed by everything that's been happening. So I come to this panel and also to Smith from a rather different perspective. I'm a political theorist, intellectual historian by training, and my book, as was mentioned earlier, is on the reception of Smith's ideas in American intellectual history and political economy. And what I was interested in is why people like to fight over Smith's legacy. Why is it such a politically useful thing to want to conscript Smith onto your side in a policy debate? And why do people still feel the need, even today, to kind of reckon with, reclaim, reinterpret Smith, what he intended, and why he's still relevant today, right? We think we're doing something new. We're not. But I think our demands and our questions are new, and they're never changing, and I think ever more urgent, as Joe was alluding to with kind of the climate crisis and the crises of care. But we still go back to this old thinker. And Smith is quite unique among 18th century thinkers in that when you look at how he's read and where he's read and how frequently he's read and invoked, I mean, to think that we're still reading, like think of all the books that were published in the 18th century, even 19th century, we're still reading The Wealth of Nations today. By one very, very rough indicator by the Open Syllabus Project, The Wealth of Nations is like the 44th most assigned text on college syllabi in the United States. Of course, we don't actually know if people are reading all of The Wealth of Nations. My guess is not. But that says something about the kind of staying power of what Adam Smith did, but not just what Smith did in his time, but what subsequent readers and interpreters have made of Smith, right? And that's what I do as an intellectual historian of his reception, is to look at what have people done to make a particular version of Smith so powerful, and how are we today thinking about why Smith could still be powerful or useful when we're thinking about specific policy questions or challenges in the 21st century. So my perspective is a bit different on this, in that I would really urge caution and really careful reading when we approach Smith and we go, we have a policy challenge today. I have a question on what we should do about wealth taxation, and I wonder if Smith would agree with me, right? What did Smith say about taxing the very rich? And you could go digging through the Wealth of Nations and find the bits that support that view, right? Let's tax some luxury goods, let's put higher taxes on carriages, and say, look, Smith in favor of progressive taxation, he must be a social democrat, right? Or you could say, you know what, I think Smith might have hesitated. Maybe I'll go through the Wealth of Nations and figure out what Smith said and find the bits of Smith that support a slightly more conservative perspective, right? And you might stumble upon the part in the Wealth of Nations, Book 5, where he proposes what are known as the kind of 4 maxims of taxation. Proportionality, right? Kind of willingness, or not willingness, but kind of ability to pay. Convenience, how convenient is it to levy the tax? Certainty, is it arbitrary or does it happen regularly, so there's some predictability to when the tax is collected? And economy, right? Not overburdening the tax base. And if you stopped there, you would think, these are very sensible principles. Smith must have been a sensible man, these are sensible policies. But if you look at not just what Smith says and what his ideas are and take 4 maxims and run with them, you actually look at what Smith does after that for the next, many, many pages. It's the how that matters. It's the how he goes about analyzing where policies fail and what happens when these are actually done in practice, right? So the next several pages of the analysis after he proposes these 4 maxims of taxation is a historical analysis, right? Smith is an incredibly historical thinker. And he shows that time and time again, whenever there's a chance to kind of introduce a new tax regime, you get trade-offs, right? There is no perfect tax regime that maximizes on proportionality, certainty, economy, and what was the other? What did I just say? Proportionality, certainty, economy, and convenience. Thank you. Right. So he goes, look at the land tax of 1690 in Great Britain. Very proportional, very uncertain, very uneconomical, and very inconvenient. Right. Then he goes, what's the French physiocrats' alternative? Well, let's make it a sliding tax, so it's more proportional, but that makes it incredibly arbitrary, not economical, and very difficult to collect. So if you read Smith's actual analysis, which relies a lot on history, right? He's incredibly sensitive to historical, cultural contingency, and the legacy of old policies and institutions in specific places. You don't walk away with a specific set of ideas of what Smith says in response to a particular policy challenge, but how Smith is thinking about it, right? He says, look at history and you will find that there are always going to be trade-offs between these different maxims. It is going to be very difficult for you to try and maximize on all 4. So that can be very disappointing, right? It's like, oh, darn, Smith doesn't have an answer for us. But I think that would be the wrong way to approach it, right? I think we should start to think more like how Smith thought rather than just trying to find what Smith thought in response to a question that we're bringing him, right? And if we were to take that example of taxation, but also plenty of other examples in the Wealth of Nations, I would say Smith is encouraging us to think very historically, very carefully, and he's drawing our attention to who is making policy, what are their incentives, what are the trade-offs, and what are the different points of conflict. So another example of this, and I know this was kind of related to a question that was brought up earlier in the audience about labor, right? So, and this addresses the question of not just we should be thinking not what Smith thought, but how Smith thought about policy, and also who is making the policy. When he talks about labor, he actually says that the law tends to side with capital, right, for lack of better words. Laws tend to favor employers, masters, who want the law to prevent workmen from combining. Basically, this idea that law tends to side with the already wealthy and powerful, and that we should be very wary of what look like regulations for labor that are encouraged by or even done kind of with the bidding of employers, right? Whereas he says laws that favor the workmen tend to always be just and equitable, right? And so I think the takeaway there is not that Smith is like a pro-labor Democrat. What he's trying to draw our attention to is the tendency for economic policy making to be made by those with a vested interest in protecting their own power. And in a commercial society, there's the basis for power, there's a new basis for power. And I'm getting to kind of Smith's political theory here. But if you look at how Smith describes kind of the basis of power in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, but also in the Lectures on Jurisprudence, he says, political authority stems from 4 sources historically. Age, superior abilities, wealth, and family. Now, in early stages of human society, like if we were in a shepherding society or hunter-gathering society, it would make sense that the people with the most political authority are the oldest, or the ones with the most, they're good at hunting boar or whatever. But he says with commercial society, where we relate to each other and we meet our needs through exchange, a new source of political authority is introduced, and that's wealth. And this is the source of commercial society's abundance, right? Its ability to lift people out of poverty, this immense capacity to create more goods cheaply and plentifully, the stuff that we've all been praising and talking about all day long, like this is a good thing. But it's a double-edged sword, right? Because with this immense capacity for wealth generation, you get a new source of political power that has this tendency, right, to kind of renew domination of the poor and the powerless at the hands of the wealthy and powerful through the state, right? Not by doing illegal things, but actually by colluding with the state. And so I think when you look at how Smith actually analyzes what are the sources of political authority, how does policy get made and who makes it, we have a very, very different view of Smith as a thinker, not just Smith, is he on my side or not? And so that's kind of my plea for how we read Smith as relevant to us today, is to kind of resist the urge to say, I have this question now, what does Smith say and is he on my side? But to look at the questions that Smith is actually writing about in his time and think, how is he thinking through these problems? What is he drawing our attention to in terms of who has vested interest and who has power, where does power lie, and what are the sources of authority? And then I think we'll have a kind of better, we'll have a clearer looking glass for how we face the challenges of our time.
Oh, fantastic. 4 brilliant contributions there. So we'll move to just a fireside chat for a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And if I could just pick up your really important contribution there, Gloria, at the end about the focus on the how of policy, and maybe link in, maybe if ask Joe to go first. The important points you were making there about value and the importance of thinking about the value there. It's an important question about who determines value and who controls the power on determining what is value. And it may be quite useful to get Adam's reflections as well about what that in terms of a crisis. But maybe if I could come to you first, Joe.
Yeah, I think this is one of the fundamental questions. What's the benchmark? What is it that we are wanting? So even when we talk about growth, and the descriptions around that Adam brought forward about the economy is continuing with growth. I mean, GDP didn't exist as a concept when when Adam Smith was writing. It was invented later. So what is it that we're actually looking to maximise? I mean, it's a fundamental question, and the public need to be engaged in that, because you might get a very different answer from different groups of people, even in terms of like whether the economy is working for different groups. It was an interesting point that you were making, Adam, about the decline, because for whom is that decline being felt? As an economy loses its world share, actually, does that feed through to the lived experience of people? And I think that's where you get the real political challenge. And I think I think that is still a danger in many societies, but it's, for example, there's a lot of evidence that shows when your inequality gets to a very wide level, then that stretches that very fabric of social cohesion. And I think we're seeing in lots of different countries around the world that manifesting in different ways. Right now, we've obviously experienced huge numbers of strikes in the UK. The same is happening in France. You've got in different countries very kind of extreme political division happening as a very common symptom of and sign, I think, of unhappiness with the way in which economy and society is happening. So actually, what do people want? I mean, that's a starting point. And you know, there are different ways of measuring different indicators. I mean, in Scotland, we have, I think there's 80 or something different indicators in the national framework now. There's also different ways of, like, who is making the decision. So I think Wales is doing something really interesting. They have designated a Future Generations Commissioner, whose job it is to speak up for future generations, because that is one group that is very disenfranchised from the decision-making process. So young people under the age of 16 or 18 literally do not have a vote. And for people who aren't yet here at all, obviously they really are just relying on other people thinking about their interests. So in Wales, they have somebody whose job it is to look at the evidence. And the first Commissioner, Sophie Howe, recently came to the end of her term, but she had this group of 20 or so officials that would be able to undertake research, and then she would be able to, make informed arguments and that changed government policy on a variety of issues. So I think looking at wider indicators, looking at getting public buy-in for those and helping to set those indicators and have a debate about those, and then also looking at how you give a voice to groups that are currently, disenfranchised, I think is really important.
Adam?
Again, this is partly coming from an American perspective, but also, I think, informed by Brexit and experiences here in the UK. I respect what Joe's saying, but I don't think it's enough to focus on what people want, because sometimes people want things that are not good. And I don't mean not good in the sense that I, patronizing East Coast globalized elite, say it's not good. I mean, they want white rural males who actively vote for Trump want women and black people to have less income and less power than they do. They want the police to be abusive. And so it's quite right to push back against blind pursuit of GDP. And I hope I wasn't suggesting that was the only thing. I was just trying to make a narrow point. But I mean, it's quite right. And we had Diane Coyle speaking earlier today, of course, with her book on GDP a few years ago. It's a very legitimate thing to do. But I think, which gets us into theory of moral sentiments and some of these other things as opposed to a wealth of nations. I just want to be careful not to set up this, you can be an economist and blind, or you can do what the people want. There has to be some reasonable discussion and debate about what the people want as well.
You know, Joe, I think you've been listening too much to economists. Because you started by saying, what are we trying to maximize? Now, for 20 years as an academic, I taught about optimization and maximizing models and the like. And then I went a bit further out into the real world and encountered business people who, whatever they thought they were doing or said they were doing, they might be following Milton Friedman and what they said, but they clearly weren't maximizing profits. So I said to myself, so what are they maximizing? And one day the scales dropped from my eyes, and I realized they weren't trying to maximize anything. Most people, whether they're business people or all of us in our everyday lives, are not trying to maximize something. We're trying to cope with complex situations that are many dimensions and are largely unpredictable. And we need to think about problems in these ways. Not develop spreadsheet models with hundreds of cells which will give us the answer. They won't.
So I guess the question, I had a couple of thoughts, and again, like, my instinct is always like to just go back and closely read Adam Smith and figure out what it is that he's actually saying in response to the questions and challenges that he's facing. But something that Joe raised really stood out to me, which is who determines value, right? Who determines why we value GDP? Like, who determines the metrics of national wealth, right? And that is the question that's on the forefront of Smith's mind when he's writing The Wealth of Nations, because the policy of the mercantile system was that national wealth was measured by gold and silver coin that you could hoard, right? And it was really just pocketed by private merchant companies like the British East India Company. And if you read book 4, the opening of book 4 quite closely, Smith has this really vivid description of how that happens. And I think that like some of the richest insights are these really detailed stories that Smith tells. I mean, they're more than stories, right? It's a historical and political analysis of why certain things get valued and how they become state policy. So he says, you know, the policy of mercantilism, or the mercantile system, he calls it, of pursuing a favorable balance of trade is like, what is the phrase he used? Like partly real and partly sophistical. And he's like, but how does it actually become state policy? You would think that this kind of absurd thing wouldn't actually become state policy. And then he shifts and he says, look, there are these merchants, and they know it's in their interest to get, as Maharafi et al. Called, these sweetheart deals, right? A regulatory apparatus that shields them from competition. So they know what is in their interest to say that giving us this kind of monopoly privilege is going to promote national wealth, right? And they sell it to legislators as this is going to be good for national wealth. But then he says, but in what way it enriches the nation, they did not know, right? It was no part of their business to know it, right? But what it was part of their business to know how it enriched themselves. The legislators, meanwhile, Smith says, is like, they're supposed to know how international trade works, but they don't. So again, these private merchant elite companies have this structural and informational advantage where they can position themselves and make arguments that don't really have much basis in, like, I don't know, in promoting general welfare, to use that phrase, right? But Smith says that they have this ability to kind of work with lawmakers to convince them that this is a form of national wealth that will be good for the nation, but it's actually not. And when I think, and that to me is really the political economy, right? When we talk about policy making, we're really talking about political economy. And Smith shows that economic policy is this, you have to pay attention to power, right? Who has power, because they ultimately determine who gets to set the rules. Some students have asked me kind of like, what is political economy? I keep throwing that term around, and I think it might just be helpful to hear how I've been describing it, and I'm getting this from a very wonderful law and political economy scholar, Amy Kepczynski. If economics is about how we meet our needs, and The Wealth of Nations shows many different ways in which humans have met their needs historically: hunting, gathering, shepherding, agricultural societies, feudalism. These are all different economies, ways we meet our needs. Commercial society is a way we meet our needs through exchange. But political economy is really about the rules we create, right? The regulatory apparatuses, the institutions we build, the norms, the morals, the state apparatuses we create that structure the way we meet our needs. And the mercantile system was one very troubling system of political economy that Smith wanted people in his time to recognize how it worked and how they could change the way they thought about where national wealth came from so that you could revalue what gets. I'm starting to sound very Nietzschean, right? Like, he's trying to say we need to revalue the value, revalue their values. And if you start thinking like he does, right? Looking through history, looking very, very carefully at the record of human experience and seeing all the complexities of different institutional designs, where they go right and where they go wrong, then you start to adopt his mindset a little bit better, and you can proceed with a little bit more caution.
You know, one of Smith's insights was to understand the idea of regulatory capture. 100 years before anyone else wrote about it, and 200 years before anyone formulated that phrase. The idea that if you set up a regulatory apparatus, then the industries affected would engage themselves in capturing control of that apparatus and use it in significant part for their own benefit. And we've talked in the course of this session or seminar a good deal about healthcare and quite a bit about financial services. And these are both the most heavily regulated and the most characteristically regulatory captured sectors of our economies.
Okay, we've got time for some questions. So if you can put your hand up and I'll come to you. There's someone right at the back.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
Thing.
By the light.
Can you
Yes.
hear me? Hi, Ozgona from University of Cambridge. Adam Smith is, my question is to Joe Swinson, actually. Adam Smith is the classical liberal, important to a species of intellectuals that is quite rare to see in liberal parties of Europe at all, including Lib Dem. Why do you think that's the case?
Why, just to clarify the question, why is it rare?
Why we do not see any classical liberals in liberal parties of Europe, in Lib Dem and so on? That's always quite puzzling to me. That's almost always, if not always, liberal parties are at odds with classical liberals. Why do you think that's the case?
I mean, I suppose you're getting into definitions of liberalism here, right? And I was interested in the slide that was about positive and negative versions of liberalism, which I suppose I, from a political thinking, would conceive of slightly differently. But I mean, I think there is this sort of, it's just about the absence of any restraints, that sort of idea of liberalism. And I'm not necessarily saying that is exactly what Adam Smith was arguing, but there is that very kind of common idea that it's just about getting rid of any kind of way in which somebody's experience is constrained. And I think that is a very privileged description of liberalism. And I mean, by definition, when we are reading the people that, were writing about in the 1700s and writing about property rights, writing at a time when people could be property, right? Yep. And so they weren't considered to be the people. When a big chunk of the population was not allowed to have property rights. I mean, whose were these property rights? If you were a woman and you got married, what was your ability to own property? So I think that for me, liberalism is actually not just about the absence of restrictions. It's actually also about what are the conditions to enable people to thrive and to have agency. And that actually requires quite a lot of positive interventions as well. And so, anyone's free to read a book, but if you don't actually have education and you can only get education if you're wealthy, then you're not free at all. It's like the kind of free speech on the internet. If you happen to be a black woman, the price of you speaking on the internet is very, very different than if you are a white man, because the abuse and the threats that will come your way are very different. So I think it comes back to that issue of power, and that to me is just so inherent in liberalism, that there are concentrations of power, and as a liberal you have to be wary of wherever those concentrations of power are.
Question?
There's two
just
on
row, is it 5 there? Around the man in the black jacket.
Today we have a variety of capitalisms. Maybe I'll call them hyper-capitalism, as in the US, or stakeholder capitalism in, let's say, Nordic countries, or a hybrid form in, let's say, in China. And the role of the state, obviously, you've had is a great deal. So my question is, what were the philosophical and political views of Adam Smith about the role of the state? Did he consider the state as a kind of exogenous entity or an endogenous entity reflecting, let's say, social and class structure? So it's open to any panel member. Thank you.
Glory, can I come to you on that one?
Oh my gosh. It's a really good question. It's a really hard question. I could go on about this forever. I think one helpful starting point is to get out of the state versus market dichotomy, because that's not how Smith thought about it. Thank you. Yes, golf clap, right? This is not a situation for Smith where free markets exist ex ante and the state comes in and intervenes where market fails, and there you go, that's what the state should do, and that you can kind of scale up or scale down from there, right? That's not at all how Smith is thinking about the role of state. rarely, I mean, he uses a variety of words. He uses states, modern states, ancient states, government, but government also looks very different in Smith time, and I'm here going to nod to Craig Smith, who has just brilliant work on kind of what local government looks like in Smith's time. So step one is get out of market versus state dichotomy. The second thing is rather, I think maybe rather than thinking about kind of the state, thinking about locuses of power, and thinking about where power is concentrated, and using the law to back, again, concentrations of power, public and private. So, you know, the East India Company was given state power eventually, but they started off as a company. So is that the state, or is that the East India Company? And I think those are precisely the kinds of questions that Smith is asking and worrying about, which is why he's writing the kind of treaties that he's writing in The Wealth of Nations. In terms of kind of like what the state should do, I would just point you to, there's a lot, I'm struggling because I'm like, I'm going everywhere. Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, on my reading, and this might be, I don't know, I'm working on this right now, actually. Like, I'm working on Smith and this idea of like state capacity, that modern states, modern as opposed to ancient, face particular challenges because, as I was saying earlier, they're uniquely capable of generating a lot of wealth and lifting people out of poverty and making goods cheaply and plentifully available. But with that power comes new forms of vulnerability, right? They are tasty prey for foreign invaders. So you have to worry about new forms of national defense and how to fund that. It's easy borrowing because you have a new class of merchants who are willing to lend to the government, but that raises new questions and alarms about state debt. And you have to think about, like, again, the question of taxation. How do you kind of construct taxation regimes that don't make really bad trade-offs? And so those are things that he attributes to say, he also uses the term the sovereign. Those are things that sovereigns have to deal with, but there's no one-size-fits-all. I think that's the other thing, right? So get out of state versus market mentality, and then also the idea that there is such a thing as the state and that there's one template that fits all, because Smith is far too historical, far too aware of contingency to kind of give a specific recommendation for how that happens. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
One particular question maybe just for John, if we could get one final question on we've had, over the course of the week, we've had quite a lot of reflection around economics and economists and how economists are trained and the analysis that economists do. So if Adam Smith was to wander back into the University of Glasgow and to design first-year political economy class, what would he include in his lectures? I'll come to John first, and it'd be really good to get Joe's reflection about what you need to help transform the economy you want.
I guess it would actually be about political economy. So we mentioned regulatory capture. There would be a good deal of that. There would, of course, have to be sessions on macroeconomic policy, where he would not find much help from economic developments in macroeconomics over the last 40 years. But he might, I hope, make a contribution to putting that on a more useful and practical route. He would talk about trade policy, probably in ways not so different from the ones he talked about in The Wealth of Nations. He would talk about business, I hope, in the light of some of the things I've been saying today. And he would talk about, he would have to talk, it's not a very seriously quantitative book in a modern sense, The Wealth of Nations, but he would have to talk about metrics and measures and the like, but he would not believe that we were going to find single metrics that would give us answers to the questions of what we ought to be trying to maximize, or single metrics that would be things we could try to control macroeconomic policies by reference to.
Adam, Gloria, anything you would add to that?
I'm just trying to think of like what is the most historical, what are some of the most historical texts? I mean, he might assign things like, I'm looking at Maria Pia Paganelli, like her work on the digression on silver and just how attentive he was to like 13th century history. People have been talking about observation and experience, and I keep coming back to Smith's use of history, right? Because that is observation and the human experience. And so I think any kind of book that does these kind of grand historical sweeps, he's using that as data. He's using that as data to tell a story about political economy. I'm also thinking about Doug Irwin's, where's Doug Irwin's great book on clashing over commerce, which is the history of trade policy. Right? I think Smith would be really interested in that work too, especially in the American case, just because of the shifts over time between seeing trade as a weapon for, not a weapon, seeing trade as a tool for revenue, but also a political weapon and reciprocity. I think he would be jazzed about that kind of analysis.
All I would say, it's very much in the spirit of Gloria, I think, is what I would want to know, what I'd want to hear his lectures on would be taking some of these key economic events and decisions, what would he think of them? So you get a certain amount about finance, but you don't get the whole development of finance and financial booms and busts the way that we're very much had to live with. You get something about the poor, what eventually goes into the poor law debate in the UK. Obviously he was before that, but I mean, he and others foretold that. But what would be his vision of how the welfare state has worked out through the years? What would be his vision of, or interpretation of China's rise? I mean, so I don't know what he would assign, but I would hope it would include his takes on those things.
You're saying, and I think this is right, that he would make more use of the kind of business school case study method.
God forbid,
Then
but he would, because unfortunately that gets us into something you rightly have decried, John, which is the deification of the individual decision maker. If you said he's going to make more use of historical case studies, yes.
No, they wouldn't be Harvard Business School cases of Joe Bloggs sitting in his 14th floor office.
Yes, that's where
wondering what to do about ABC.
Yeah, that's what I meant by the God forbid, yes.
And Joe, final comment from you?
So yeah, I think John's quite right to pick me up on that. It's not about maximisation. In a world of such complexity, it is much more about balance and the connections and interdependencies between different issues and how we all navigate those. So I think as a result, it needs to be, it's not the binary of state v market. It's also about, Eleanor Ostrom's work on the commons and where does the household sit and how does it all work together. And so perhaps most importantly, it needs to be pluralist in terms of all of the different traditions and schools of economics, because it's not one size fits all. This is the model that you're going to apply to every problem. What is the problem and what is the thinking that can best help you understand it? And also, it is not just about economics. What are the links with all of the other departments within the university, with the science departments, the sociology and the psychology, to really understand the richness of the world and the real world problems that economics should be playing an important role in trying to solve.
Great. That's a great note to end on, and a really important one. Can you please join me in thanking the panel for this? Well, everyone, this marks the end of the formal part of today's symposium. I hope we've been able to bring Adam Smith and his ideas alive for you. We've heard about Adam Smith, the student, the professor, and the global figure that he's become, and hopefully the archives, the play, the being around the music, being around the university has brought him alive a bit more for me beyond the name that you might just hear about. We've had some fantastic conversations over the course of the week about the issues and ideas that Smith was thinking of. We spoke about AI, inequalities, cryptocurrencies, race, trade, and what actually is the wealth of a nation. And if you haven't seen them yet, please do go through and see do go through and see the student competitions where students, young people, are telling us about what they see is the wealth of the nation. It's been a huge privilege to have so many distinguished speakers to attend Glasgow. The enthusiasm from the project from day one has helped to provide motivation to us all. And can you please join me in thanking not just this panel, but all the panelists today one more time. I counted up, this is the 10th event that we've had this week, but it's not the end. Throughout the remainder of the year, we're continuing our Smith the Scholar, Smith the Educator, and Smith the Citizen theme. Next week, supported by our Library Archives and Special Collections team, we welcome Smith scholars from Japan, the United States, and Europe to join our Adam Smith Marginalia workshop. The Smith Educator work continues. So since January, Craig Smith has been running a global reading group on the Wealth of Nations, which has brought Wealth of Nations alive to hundreds of people from around the world. And it will be relaunched later this year. Later this month, we're running the first ever Adam Smith Summer School, where students from around the world are coming along to study Adam Smith and spend some time here in Glasgow. And later on this summer, we're launching an initiative with the Economist Foundation, an interactive lesson that we built up around Smith's thinking on economics, very much picking up the comments that Joe had, prepared for 4,000 high school students around the world. And we're also running a summer school with the Sutton Trust to bring students from the west of Scotland who might not normally think of the University of Glasgow as somewhere they might come to study, to come along and have a lesson and experience the university and show that the university is their home. And as we know, Smith was a figure of the Scottish Enlightenment. Debates like today were crucial to his thinking and crucial to who he was, and that passionate value of constructive, inclusive dialogue. I think today we achieved that. Graeme Ogilvie, our fantastic artist, has captured that conversation that you can see behind us, and there'll be a chance to look at that on the way out. Can we please just thank Graeme for his fantastic art? As you know, we've been taking Adam Smith around the world. So far, we've had 10 events so far this year, from Chicago to Canberra, Beirut to Barbados, and Beijing to, I was looking for another B, but we ended up at Nairobi, so I didn't get there. It doesn't end there. We've got another 10 events scheduled for later in this year. A huge thanks to our supporters, including the John Templeton Foundation, the Hunter Foundation, AMBA, the Global Business School Network, and the Economics Observatory. Thanks to Siobhan, Graeme and Julie from the library and the archives, Helen for the music composition, the in-company theatre production, and most importantly, a heartfelt personal thanks to the University of Glasgow, the College of Social Sciences and Adam Smith Business School, from our faculty right the way through to our communications events team, who've done an amazing job, not just to bring Adam Smith alive, but to show off what I think is the best of the University of Glasgow.